We now have some working code for reading in some of our photosynthetically active radiation data. Perhaps we should think a little bit about what this is going to look like when we generate the report. So I've changed the processing RMD to have this code chunk that's reading in some data. Let's go back and open up our processing.r script that renders the report and see what happens. I know the code's working because I was able to run the chunk separately using RStudio to make sure it works. So hopefully we won't have any problems with the code running when we compile or render the Rmarkdown. We can go to our incremental folder where our processing notes HTML is located. I'm going to open this up in a web browser. Let's bring the web browser over to this screen where you can see it. And now you can see that we've had the line of code, or I'm sorry, the paragraph of information that we put in at the head of this document. But now you can see by default, as we've discovered before, our Markdown is going to echo the code. So it's echoing all the code that is in that chunk. And we're really not seeing anything else because this code doesn't really generate anything in the way of output or text. It's just changing variables in the global environment. So for this particular report, it's not really that we want this code to show up in our report. It's more information about what this code is doing should show up in the report. So let's address that. We'll go back to R, go back to our R Markdown document, and we'll start looking at this chunk. So perhaps first of all, we want to give some information in the report about what happened when we read in this original file. So I've got the path specified here. I'm reading in the headers here. And then I'm reading in the data with the second call to read table, and I'm applying the headers that I read into the data frame that I'm reading. So perhaps this is a place where we want to put some information into the R Markdown that tells us that we are reading the files. Also, perhaps we want to add a new header to say something like reading data. So we've got our main header for PAR deployment. Here's our paragraph of information, or in this case, it's just one sentence. And now we're going to start reading data. So we're going to start with a new Markdown header called reading data. And here's our chunk. And perhaps we want to send some information about what's going on back into the report at this point in our code chunk. Well, first of all, we need to make sure that we change the chunk options such that the echo is false and the results are as is. So I'm going to copy and paste those two arguments from this chunk up here. And that means we will not echo the code anymore, and any results or text that's generated by this code is going to be put back into the Markdown as is without any changes or additional formatting. And then I can use the cat function, which will concatenate several things and send it to output without altering the formatting. And I'm going to set the sep argument to nothing, or to an empty string, to tell it I don't want to put any extra characters in between the items that I'm concatenating and sending to the output. Okay, so this is my setup. Now I can start thinking about what I want to send into the report at this point. So perhaps I want to say a total number of so many records were read from file. And I've just put placeholders in here because this is where I'm going to insert our code that's going to automate the content that's going into the Markdown. So I've got a total number of, this is where I want it to put in the total number of records that it read in when it read this table. And I can get at that using the nrow of the table. Remember, we have this function nrow that will return the number of rows in a data frame if we call nrow on a data frame. So I can put nrow table here. I'm going to go ahead and add an extra line here because I'm getting close to the edge and I want to make sure I have plenty of room. Oh, and it's also giving me an error because I don't have a comma after this. I need to make sure that whatever I put here has a comma after it. So I'm concatenating the string a total number of with a space here, and then the n rows in the table will tell me how many records are in that row. And then again, blank records were read from file. Oh, I'm going to probably need a space there. And then I can put the file name here, which I've already got designated as the path. So I'm going to use the path character string that I already have, and I'm going to put that in the report. One other thing that I like to do is make sure that paths are italicized. So I'm going to put a star before and after the path to make sure that gets italicized. Okay, and I need to spell number right. There we go. A total number of n-row table records were read from the file path, and I put asterisks around that to allow for the path in this part of the report to be italicized. Let's see how that works. I'm going to save my RMD file, and I'm going to rerun my Rmarkdown render. I'm going to bring up my processing notes HTML, hit refresh. Now you can see I have a new header called reading data, and I have this line of Markdown, or this line in the report that says a total of 46,638 records were read from file, and in italics I've got ./1 input data logger downloads, so it's got the full path that I read to the file from which the data were read. So recall, in order to get the report to look like this, we had to copy and paste these chunk options, echo is false, results is as is, from one chunk to another. We copied it from here to this chunk to make sure this code wasn't echoed, and to set it up so that when we send results to the Markdown, they will be sent without formatting, as we've done with this function call, this cat function call. Perhaps we don't want to have to keep putting in these two different arguments if it's our default setting, if this is something that we need to happen every time that we run a chunk. This is my kind of how I usually operate, is having echo turn to false and results to as is when I'm writing this kind of report where I typically don't want the code to show up in the report. So I can do that by setting up somewhere above all of my other chunks a call to a function that lets me set the default value of chunks. So let's say at the very top of this our Markdown document, I'm going to create a code chunk. And I'm going to introduce another chunk option here. There we go. I specify a chunk option with a pound and a pipe character. And then this one I'm going to call include. And I'm going to set it to false. Include is just a quick way to make sure that nothing about this particular chunk will end up back in the Markdown. Either the echo or the results, nothing's going to show up back into the Markdown report. And I am going to use the knitter package and I'm going to use the set method of the ops chunk object in order to set the default chunk options that will apply throughout the rest of this particular R Markdown. So I know that's pretty complicated. Let's go through this one more time. We've got knitter, that's the name of the package. We have 2 colons to specify that I want to go to the contents of that package. There is an object called ops chunk that has the function set as a component of that object. So we have ops chunk $set, and set is just a function that we can use to set the different chunk options. And the options that we want to set are echo is going to be set to false. So now we're just providing arguments to a function, just like any other R function. So the argument is echo. We're going to set its value to false. And we're also going to set the value of the results argument to as is, as a character string, all one word. So basically, if we set up these as our default chunk options, then the rest of the chunks won't need these arguments. So I'm going to get rid of those, and I'm going to get rid of these because I shouldn't have to set those anymore. Those are the defaults. So let's see how this works. I'm going to save this. I'm going to go back and I'm going to run our processing script to render the report. Then I can go back to the report and hit refresh, and basically it doesn't look any different, which is exactly what we would expect. We made those changes, but the settings that we made with those changes were to make sure that the chunks would not echo any code, and they would also send any text back into the Markdown as it is without any formatting, which is how we had it before. We just were doing it in a different way. So that's just a way that you can set your default chunk options in a chunk earlier in the document to make sure that you don't have to keep setting those chunk options over and over again if you have a particular way that you typically use your chunks.